Welcome everyone to coming to this joint webinar run by the BES and SEB. My name is Dylan and I'm the Senior Grants Officer for the BES, which is the British Ecological Society. Just before we get started, there is just a few bits of general housekeeping to go over. I'm sure for most of you this isn't your first Zoom meeting, but generally if you are an audience participant, if you can just mute your mic while the speakers are talking. If you do have any questions throughout the webinar, we're very open to questions. There's a few different ways you can ask them, so you can put them in the chat and we'll have Beck and Anna monitoring the chat for questions. You can also raise your hand while someone is speaking and then we'll come to you as well. If you don't know how to raise your hand, there is a more button option that you can do it, or there's also a react button as well for raising your hand. And then you may have also heard or noticed, but this meeting is being recorded as well. So afterwards, this video will be shared on our channels. But we will stop the recording when it comes to questions at the very end of this webinar. So if you aren't comfortable being on the camera, don't worry, your face won't be shown during the question section. If you do want to have your camera off, that's fine. But of course, we're very happy if cameras are on as well, because it's nice being able to see everyone and who's here. So they are the majority of the housekeeping rules. So before I hand over to SEB now, this is just a chance if anyone does have any questions before we start. And also you're very welcome to introduce yourselves in the group chat as well, because not only is this a webinar, sometimes people treat this as good networking opportunities as well. So if you want to introduce yourself in the chat and maybe the organization you're with and what you're hoping to get out of this webinar, that would be helpful as well. And we are scheduled to finish at 12:30 today. So I'll now, also quick introductions. So as already, my name is Dylan. So I'm the Senior Grants Officer for the BES. And I'll now pass over to Sheila and Suzanne, who are with the SEB. So Sheila, would you like to go first?
Yeah, hello, welcome everybody. Apologies, I can't seem to get my camera to work at the moment, and I've pressed all the buttons, but I can't seem to be visible. But otherwise, I would have that on. So my name's Sheila Amiti-Dargan. I'm the Outreach, Education and Diversity Trustee for the Society for Experimental Biology. And I'm going to give you an introduction to our educational research and development grants in a moment. Are we going to do introductions of everyone else first, or do you want me to?
Yeah, Suzanne, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Suzanne Workel. I'm from the University of Liverpool. I'm a member of the Outreach, Education and Diversity Group in SEB, and I'm involved in reviewing grants there as well.
And Marianne?
Hi everybody, my name is Marianne Freeman. I am the current co-chair for the Grants Committee for the BES. You'll hear more about me later.
And we do have Neil here today as well. So Neil is one of the BES grant winners, and he'll be talking a bit about his research. He's just having a few issues with Zoom at the moment, but he will hopefully be here for when we get to his section. And Sheila, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not going to take up too much of this time. I just really wanted to make everyone aware that we have educational research and development grants now at the Society for Experimental Biology. We have two awardees at the moment. So we've just ran our first round of applications and those grants are underway at the moment. Rebecca, if you could go to the next slide, please. So all of this information is on our SEB website. I just thought I'd give a bit of an overview about why we introduced these grants. So our main rationale for introducing them was really to support both educators and academics who are involved in education at any level of their career progression in higher education to fund projects that would support students, but also support the career progression of staff who are involved in teaching experimental biology. We know that for a lot of teaching focused staff, it's quite hard to demonstrate external impact. So this ability to obtain some funding from an external organisation and also get some support from people who have done educational research projects themselves. We're often kind of dual disciplines in that a lot of us are trained in biology, and yet we then undertake scholarly educational research, and that can be a bit of a jump for people. So in addition to providing the funding for the people who are successful in obtaining these grants, and even those who are not successful, we offer some support and training to help people really do impactful research and initiatives that are really hopefully publishable, but also having a lot of impact on the ground. Next slide, please. So for grants to be successful, we do encourage people to contact us informally if they're thinking about putting in an application, so we can support on that side as well. But what we're really looking for is applications that will really kind of be transferable to other disciplines within the life sciences and also have an impact on our society of members. We encourage people to try and put in proposals that are collaborations between 2 or more institutions, or even just 2 institutions. And again, this is really to increase the impact and sharing of good practice, and also building networks so that people who want to do educational research can have a bit more external impact and meet people outside of their own organisation. So we do have a outreach, education and diversity focus group, which people can join even if they're not a member of SEB, to meet people who have similar interests in educational research. So some people doing assessment and feedback, for example, or people looking at improving practicals in experimental biology, lots of different areas, but to help people connect beyond their own institution. These grants don't support outreach, because we have a separate outreach grant that people can apply for, and they also don't fund purchase of equipment that sits locally. So we really want this to be kind of community building and really transferable outputs. Next slide, please, Rebecca. So what can people apply for if you're not an SEB member? If you're a non-member, so if you're here because you're part of BES or you're thinking about joining one of our societies, you can apply for grants for up to £200. You can get a small pot of money to get going, and you're welcome to join our outreach, education and diversity group if that's of interest to you. SEB members can apply for up to £2,000 at the moment, and that's quite a good amount of money to get going and maybe pay some student researchers to do something as part of your project, or get some consumables. These are open worldwide, so whatever country you're in, you're very eligible to apply for these grants. And if you want to know more about the eligibility criteria, look on the SEB website, and there's lots of information. We have 2 deadlines, so you can apply whenever you want during the year, but we have 2 deadlines when we then start actually reviewing the applications that have come in. So the 31st of January and the 30th of June. So they're 2 dates maybe to put in your calendars if you're thinking about applying for these grants. We try to turn it around quite quickly. So as Suzanne said, she's one of our reviewers on the grant panel. So we normally judge the January applications in February, and we notify our applicants in March. And then the June applications will be reviewed in July, and the outcomes will be announced in August. So it's quite a quick turnaround. We also pick these dates because people doing educational research may want to focus on doing some research over the summer when they've actually got some headspace to do this research, or they may want to be doing it while they've got students in place. So it just gives a little bit of flexibility depending on what you're doing as well. The money should be spent within a year, and we provide training if needed and support with ethics applications and things like that. So last slide, and then I'll stop talking and hand over. So our grants are judged by 5 criteria, and again, these are available on our website, and we can circulate a link, because I forgot to put it in the slide, sorry, after the meeting. And we're really looking at the quality of the proposal, how relevant it is to experimental biology. So it can go a little bit beyond experimental biology, but it needs to be biology focused. What impact is it going to have? How are the outputs going to be disseminated? So we're really keen on transferability and the things that other people can take on and improve their own education in this area. And they need to be really realistic as well, because it's only £2,000 and it's only funding a year's worth of research. So we want to see proposals that are achievable within that time frame and within that budget. So we provide feedback to all of our applicants at the moment, because we've got the capacity to do that. So even if you apply and you're not successful, we will give feedback and often encourage you to reapply in the next round. So we want to see these grants as an opportunity to support people, as well as just, put in your grant and hope for the best. So, if you have any queries, do get in touch with us. Otherwise, I'll hand over to Suzanne unless there's any questions. Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions, or shall I proceed?
You can always pop questions in the chat if you want, and I'll keep an eye on the chat and answer questions that way. So Suzanne, you can go ahead.
Okay, I'll share my screen now and make a start. Okay. Okay, so I hope you can see my slides.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've been asked to talk a little bit about educational research, what it is and how it differs from bioscience research, because quite a lot of people are maybe quite new to educational research, so hopefully that might be useful. So I will be talking about... I will be talking about what is educational research actually, and why somebody should be doing it, how educational and bioscience research differ or are the same, a bit about designing and planning educational research, and finally a bit about publishing. So, what is educational research? When you Google this term, there are quite a lot of definitions coming up that are vaguely the same, but I quite like this one here. Educational research refers to a systematic attempt to gain a better understanding of the educational process, generally with a view in improving its efficiency. So the emphasis on improving is something that really appeals, I think. Why would we do educational research? Well, maybe curiosity, so exploring some interesting issues around education. Quite often as practitioner, we would do research that helps us improve practice. So we might have an innovation that we want to implement and then evaluate. So we can also do educational research to shape educational policy, either on a national basis or institutional basis. And of course, it helps us to evidence the scholarship of teaching and learning, which is important for people who are on a more teaching focused role. So moving on to educational versus bioscience research, and in particular looking at publications. So I don't know if anybody has already read some educational research articles or papers. If you do, you will notice some things that are very similar to bioscience research and some differences as well. So similarities include that the papers are based on really rigorous research. They will all have a literature review, which will provide a rationale for the study and will include a research question, aim, or hypothesis. There will be a robust methodology, appropriate data analysis, and discussion and conclusion. So very similar in both areas. There are also some differences, of course. So you will find that the language and terminology in educational papers is a little bit different. There is, of course, the methods are different, and the study objects. So in educational research, you observe living humans, whereas in bioscience research, that is obviously not always the case. The type of data will differ, and also the way the data are analyzed in some way. Okay, so moving on to designing and planning educational research. So if you're thinking of starting an educational research project, there are a number of things to consider. So the very first thing, obviously, you should need to think about is, what is it actually you want to do? So, for example, do you want to explore an issue to find out more about why certain things are happening, what students are thinking, what's going on, or do you want to actually solve a problem? And many practitioners in teaching would go down the route of solving a problem, so having an innovation, for example, trying it out and see if it can solve a particular problem in the teaching context. So it's very important that you are clear in your head what is actually you want to achieve. The next step is, of course, literature, search, and reading. So you need to read around the paper. We want to know what is already known in the literature. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. You don't want to make the same mistakes as others or duplicate exactly what somebody else is doing. So what is already out there? How did other authors approach something similar? So we can learn from that and also take some tips on the methodology we might want to use. Now, how do you find educational papers? It's not necessarily the same process or the same tools, really. So databases might be a little bit different. So rather than going to PubMed or Web of Science, you would maybe go to Sage, JSTOR, Educational Research Complete, and things like that. Web searches, Google Scholar is always good, but you can also try ERIC or the British Australian Education Index. And of course, you can also use ChatGPT or other tools of generative artificial intelligence that will help you find relevant papers. So once you've gotten a bit more background and know what's out there in the field, you need to formulate your research question. And this question needs to be really clear, and you need to have a specific question or questions and aims, and that ties in with the educational grant application. So you need to be very clear on what actually your research question is. You need to think, of course, about the methodology. So how can you find out what you want to know? So how would you know that your intervention worked if you are going down that route? So you might want to think about, do you need baseline data? Do you need a control group, for example? You need to think about who is your study cohort. So, for example, is it a particular course, students on a particular course where you are looking at, or is it a bigger cohort? So who are actually the people you want to include in your study? What kind of methodology are you using? Is it quantitative? Is it qualitative data? Or is it a mixed approach, which is often quite useful? So you might be thinking of using surveys, focus groups, interviews, and things like that. There is the issue of triangulation that you might think might consider. So this basically means that you approach a question from two different angles, and so, for example, you might combine a survey question and then follow this up with interviews to see the question from a different perspective as well. Then turning to funding, so that's again important when you think about research grant. So what kind of things would you need during your research project, and what could you get? What could you spend the money on? So it's really depending on the project that you are thinking of, but you might spend money on software and equipment. Perhaps transcriptions for audio recordings, perhaps vouchers and refreshments if you hold focus groups. So it's often quite useful to offer a little bit of reimbursement for participants in study groups, in focus groups. You might want to produce brochures, posters. You might want to pay a student intern to help you with the analysis of your data, and so on. So in general terms, I would say for the majority of educational projects, you don't need an awful lot of money. So they can be quite cheap, but a little bit of money to have to spend on these things is often very useful. Some practicalities to consider, so a time plan, including when is your study cohort actually available. It's not very useful to plan something that is happening over the summer when the students are actually not there. You need to think about, do you need permissions in order to, for example, send questionnaires to students? Do you need any training? For example, do you know how to develop a good questionnaire? It's not as easy as it sounds, so a little bit of training there is good. Or training on data analysis, for example, how to do thematic analysis if you want to analyze qualitative data and things like that. And last but not least, you need to think about ethics approval. In the vast majority of cases, an educational research project would need ethics approval, usually from your own institution. So you need to find out a little bit about how is it done in your institution. And it is actually something, even though I mentioned it last year, it is something that you probably need to think about very early on in your project, because the ethics approval process can take an awful lot of time, and it can hold you back if you don't do it in time. So I would encourage you to tackle that particular problem relatively early on in your planning. One tip for me is really to try and collaborate. It's often very useful to work with other people. And as you've heard from Sheila, so we are encouraging people to work from different institutions to work together. Collaborating means that you can rely on, you can bring in different kind of expertise, but you also to hold each other to account, to bring the whole project forward. So it's often really useful to work together. Now, if you have done your research and you want to publish and really to have some impact on your study, so a few considerations here as well. So let's think about, for example, peer-reviewed journal articles. So you might want to think about what journal to publish in, and so you get ideas about which journals you could go for when you have been reading the literature. So take a note of where and what kind of journals have interesting articles that are relevant to your project. Where have they been published? So this might give you some ideas of where you could send your paper to. Have a look at the scope of the journal. Is it more practice or more theory oriented? Who are you thinking of is your target audience? So as kind of a general audience, higher education educators in general. Do you want to reach a national or international audience? Is your project more discipline specific or more widely applicable? So for example, if your project is about field courses, then it's not so relevant maybe for the general audience. So you might want to think about more specific journals here. You might want to think about how frequently they publish. Is it open access? Is there publication costs? And these kind of things. So very similar considerations that you would have for bioscience research. And you might perhaps think about ranking, although usually in educational research that might not be so much in the foreground of what we're thinking about. So I'm just showing here some examples of science education journals. So for example, International Journal of STEM Education, Science Education, and so on. So there are a number of science education journals out there. But when we think about more bioscience-focused examples, so we have the Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education, Biochemistry and Molecular Biology Education, and so on. And here's one on ecology. So there are journals out there that are more geared towards particular discipline. So there are some specific education journals, but some journals, for example, the FABS Open Bio, have education sections. So even though the title of the journal might not immediately indicate that they accept education research, many of them do. So have a look around and see what appeals to you most, and so what might be a suitable journal for you. So we've talked about research articles, but there are other types of publications as well. So that ranges from case studies, reflections, review papers, books and book chapters, handbooks, conference presentations and abstracts, blogs and websites, and so on. So there's a lot out there how you can get your study out there and get some impact. Here are some readings on educational research and also on various education journals that you might find helpful. And that's all really I wanted to say here. And I'll stop sharing and come back to you.
Thanks, Suzanne. So I'll soon pass over to Neil. So Neil is actually one of our very recent grant winners. So he was awarded a grant back in, I want to say, May this year. So the BES just launched pedagogical grants this year. So pedagogy is an area of growing research that funders are interested in. And people like British Ecological and SEB get more and more interested in funding pedagogical research. So Neil's just going to come to talk a bit about his research so you can get more of an idea of the type of research that we're funding at the moment. So Neil, I'll pass it over to you. You should be able to share your screen.
Yeah, I'll try just now. So you should be able to see my PowerPoint.
Yep.
Oh, wow, I'm not very good with Zoom, that's for sure. Slideshow. Okay, so you should be able to see that now, sharing. Brilliant.
Yeah, perfect.
So, my name's Neil. I'm a lecturer in Environmental and Geographical Sciences at the University of Stirling, and I'm going to be sharing with you sort of my journey from researching mud and fossils to undergoing pedagogical research, specifically looking at climate anxiety among our students. And this is all, as Dylan said, funded through the British Ecological Society, through their pedagogical grants. So what I'll cover in this talk is just basically give a background of who I am or who I was as a researcher, as a sort of interdisciplinary geoscientist, and then what drew me to pedagogical research, and then what advice I might have. And there'll be some overlap there with what Suzanne has said in the previous talk. I'll then explain why we're developing a pedagogical framework for alleviating climate anxiety, and also what we hope to achieve over the time of this grant. So my background, right back at the beginning, I was a geographer, so that gave me loads of diverse skills, but I actually have a little bit of background in sort of professional teacher training. So I did a professional graduate diploma in education at the University of Strathclyde, before doing some teaching placements in high school. So that's similar to a PGCE down south. And then I went back to do my PhD, and I'll explain what that was all about in the next slide. But over the past year, I've been covering contract as a lecturer and teaching scholar. So really quite a different idea from what my PhD was all about. So my PhD was all about sediments, microfossils, and really ties in with sea level rise. I was interested in how ice sheets respond to global warming, and it's really, really important research, societally important research. The figure from the IPCC really points that out. But one thing that really sort of got to me at this time is, how can you have more impact? When we think about impact in a field like this, what does that look like? You might impact policy, and that's probably the biggest thing you can do, is impact global policy. But actually, you might feel like not as much being done as could be done. But with pedagogical research, that's completely different, because pedagogical research is about your students. You get to see changes in your students day to day. You get to see the impact of your research every day. So we are developing a skills-based pedagogical framework for alleviating climate anxiety. From knowledge-informed students to anti-fragile, I'll explain what that means in a minute, and environmentally committed citizens. So this is what we decided to do. So what is climate or eco-anxiety, first of all, before we talk about why we're deciding to tackle it? Well, there are lots of different definitions, from non-specific worry about our relationship to support environments to other definitions, which might use terms like chronic fear of environmental doom. So what we're really getting at here is there's a whole scale of different degrees of eco or climate anxiety. So from some people with real climate despair to the point where they don't want to get out of bed in the morning, they can't get out of bed, they can't go to class. That's not what we want. However, a little bit of climate concern, a little bit of anxiety might actually not be such a bad thing. So we want to alleviate some of that more extreme climate anxiety. And this slide really sums that up when we're talking about different degrees of climate anxiety, because there's some evidence that it can result in reduced climate action. However, there is some evidence to the contrary, and that depends on the degree, as I mentioned there. Most importantly, it's young people, women, left-wing and environmentally engaged individuals who are most at risk. And that makes up a significant percentage of our students. So why wouldn't we want to do something to help these groups, particularly those experiencing climate despair? So if we want to understand climate anxiety, understanding generalised anxiety is a pretty good place to start. Are there similar trends, and can we combat it with similar mechanisms? Well, these are some sort of really scary statistics from Jonathan Haidt, from a talk he gave earlier this year. So we can see here in the United States the prevalence of anxiety, self-reported anxiety, among different age groups. And what they observe is that around 2011, 2012, there's big spikes, particularly in younger groups, the 18 to 25, again, a massive proportion of our students, and also the sort of millennial group, the one that I'm in. So you might say, well, okay, but are these just people who are more willing to talk about their anxiety, which is definitely a good thing? Unfortunately, we see these trends in self-harm as well. So it really is a genuine increase in anxiety among these groups. And it's also across multiple countries as well, and these data come from the UK. So they pin this down to social media, reactions on social media. Now, we can't control that, but what I thought we might be able to control with the parallel between climate anxiety is this idea of that these increases in anxiety are due to a lack of skills development as a result of minimal exposure to childhood and teenage experiences. So the human brain is effectively like, it has to be put through stresses, but you have to have the skills to cope with those stresses. And it comes down to this term they use, anti-fragile. So anti-fragile is similar to resilience, but resilience is something which doesn't break. Anti-fragile is something that gets stronger. So a good way to think of that is like your muscles. If you exercise your muscles, you might tear them a little bit, but then they'll grow back stronger. So what we want to do over the course of this project is to quantify the prevalence of climate anxiety among our students in ecology, biology and environmental science degrees. Develop new skills-based teaching frameworks, which we've now done. And so we're going to have part online framework and also in-person cooperative workshops. And our IT assistant, Linda Skip, who's one of our undergraduate students, has been really brilliant actually in pushing forward what this cooperative workshop should look like for students and actually make them really feel part of a cohort. We'll then have students engage with this online digital tool that I mentioned. I'll say more about that in a minute, before we reassess the prevalence of climate anxiety among our students. So the student workshops and the digital online tool will help students to gain cooperative and personal coping strategies. So we got together over the summer, so we got some practitioners and academics from psychology, sustainability. Some people have been through cognitive behavioural therapy, and also people from all sorts of fields, pedagogy and mathematics even as well. So I came up with some really interesting ideas with all these people. But here are our suite of skills for personal coping strategies for tackling climate anxiety. So you can look at them. I obviously don't have time to talk about this. I'm taking a wee while here. But things like not catastrophizing about climate change, although it's very tempting to do so, obviously. But it's actually best to see the world in shades of grey. It's not 2 degrees of warming or catastrophe. There's got to be some sort of gradient there. And we also want students to do things like appreciate their own impact, the impact that they're having on the people within their community, and also the impact they're having on reducing climate and eco impacts through their own good. So they're just 2 examples of skills, but you can see the whole suite there. So our digital framework is a 5-week course, and there's lots of sort of interactive tasks. We want it to be as interactive as possible. We've also got some thought-provokingly optimistic tasks. For example, the panel in the bottom left, and we asked the students to what do they think is the accurate CO2 emissions from 1900 to 2019 in the UK. Now, most people think it's the green line, and to be honest, I did. It turns out it's actually the red line. So celebrating these sort of small wins and also sort of more optimistic looks on where we're actually making progress. We've also got some success stories from a diverse range of people and other people who've been through climate anxiety and sort of now are able to cope with it, and it's not as sort of debilitating for them. And we've also got some really inspirational and informative videos, like this TED Talk from Hannah Ritchie, which I definitely suggest everybody go to watch. So what advice can I provide? I won't take much longer. If you're going to think about doing pedagogical research, look for something unique. Look for something that interests you. That's what I'm getting at with the figure in the top left. Think outside the box. Do something unusual. Do something that hasn't been done before. And as Suzanne said, the ethics are absolutely can be a lot more challenging when you've got human participants, especially when you're used to working with fossils. Talk to people, talk to students, talk to other educators, talk to people from all sorts of walks of life, and you'll come up with some really interesting ideas. And think about time as well, because things take a lot longer working with participants than plants and animals. But just to leave it on this, we can educate more effectively. How would you improve how we educate? And how would you improve the student experience in students' lives? Those are sort of things that I sort of was thinking about when I came up with this idea. So thanks. I hope it didn't go on too long. Thanks for listening.
Perfect. Thanks, Neil. That's really good. It's always nice to hear what our grant awardees are up to. But yeah, hopefully listening to Neil has given you an idea of the type of research we've done, novel ideas, new ways to educate people, unique ways. And again, if you've got any questions for Neil, feel free to pop them in the chat or raise your hand. But if not, I will move on to the final section of this webinar, which is covering more general grant writing tips and grant writing tips specific to pedagogical grants as well. There will be a little bit of repetition between what I'm going to be saying to Marianne and what Suzanne was saying earlier, but hopefully that means if any information has been repeated, it probably means it's pretty important and you should consider it when writing your own grant applications as well. So I'm just going to share my PowerPoint now. Here it is. So can everyone see a PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yeah, yes. Good. Perfect. So these are the grants in the British Ecological Society. But as I said, you may notice there's some repetition with the SAB, and for a lot of small funders, a lot of the grant writing process and in terms of the application process and the reviewing process is relatively similar. So even though this is covering BES, a lot will apply to other grants as well. Often I get emails from people asking how they find grants, and often it's just down to Google searches. But one site I do really like for finding funders is a website called Get Grants. Get Grants is really, really good. They do loads of free training, and they've got a pretty good grant finding funder as well. But a lot of small funders will also highlight other funding organizations. So for example, we've got an other funders page, and I know the SEB also have an other funders page as well. So if you're finding the eligibility criteria doesn't quite meet what you need, it's good just to do a little bit of searching, and you might actually find you end up down a rabbit hole and you're on 10 different grant given websites. But sometimes you just need to do a little bit of research before you find a grant that fits your project. So again, just this applies to multiple funding bodies, but there's normally made up of a grants team when making funding decisions. So in the BES, there's me, who's the senior grants officer. So normally when you first think of writing a grant application, you're going to have a few questions. You'll be contacting that organization's grant given team. So if you contact the BES, it'll be me who emails you. Once you apply, it's sent to a review college. So in the BES, we've got over 400 people reviewing our grant application. So quite a lot of people. And we're a global review college as well. And that kind of brings me to the first piece of advice is the people reviewing your applications may not be experts in that field. So most grant giving bodies will try and match up your applications with reviewers as best they can, but it will not always be a perfect match. So when writing your grant applications, make sure you're being as clear as possible. And then if your application does well, it'll be sent to a grants committee, and they'll kind of make the final funding decisions based on the comments made from the review college. So it's just a little timeline here. First you apply, then it goes through initial eligibility check. So every single grant you apply for will have eligibility. So make sure you're passing all of them, because if you don't pass them, they won't be sent for review. Then it's reviewed by 3 different people, further review by the grants committee, and then you'll be finding out your application outcome. I normally encourage people to apply for grants. If they do meet the eligibility criteria, that's the most important thing, because if you meet the eligibility criteria and you apply, a lot of times you will get feedback on your applications. So it's one of two things. You're either going to be great and successful, you've got funded, but even if you're unsuccessful, you often get feedback on your grant applications, will help you write future applications as well. But it often takes practice. And for many, writing a pedagogical grant might be their first time ever writing a grant application. It is good to get that practice, even though it does seem a little bit daunting. So this is what our grants aim to do. So a picture you see there is just one of our grant winners. He was a small research grant winner. But next year, if you are thinking of applying for a pedagogical grant in the BES, we've got 2 rounds, so January and June. And just some general guidelines. I really must emphasize, read all of the grant criteria, because there's nothing worse spending hours writing a grant application only to find that actually your grant doesn't meet all of the criteria, because if it doesn't, it won't be sent for review. Give your references plenty of notice. I do find that the majority of our grant applications do come in on deadline day or the day before. It just seems to be a natural thing, especially with academics. Not so sure about teachers, but sometimes references can take a bit of time to get back to you. So if your deadline's 2 weeks away, you should be telling your reference 2 weeks from the deadline, not a day or 2 before the deadline, because a lot of times it's unlikely deadlines can be extended. Which is my next point. Make sure you submit before the deadline. It's amazing the amount of people who don't submit before the deadline, but they've got time the day after the deadline. But don't assume that the deadline can be extended. And the safest thing to do is submit before the deadline, at least 2 or 3 days before the deadline. So if anything does happen, you make sure you're giving yourself plenty of time. Ask questions as well. So this comes back to reading all the grant criteria. If there's nothing you're unsure of or there's anything you want to clarify, make sure you're getting in contact with that grants team and you're asking them as many questions as you can. I'm happy to answer questions. I want to help people write good applications. But if you don't ask questions, then submit an application and then find out you aren't eligible, you're going to be pretty disappointed and kicking yourself. So make sure if you ever have questions, don't be afraid to ask the grants teams. That's what they're there for. And then moving on to more general grant writing tips. So that's kind of application process. Make sure your grant has got clear goals. So don't be overly ambitious with your grants, but don't be under ambitious either. So it's kind of finding that balance, but don't be setting yourselves 5 or 6 hypotheses or targets, because that's likely to be picked up as overly ambitious. And most grants give you a 12-month window. So just be clear, what is it exactly you want to achieve? So setting yourself 1 to 2, 3 max kind of clear goals of what it is you want to do. Make sure you've got a well-structured and easy-to-follow plan. So people who design grant applications, they spend a lot of time designing grant applications, but there isn't any single form that will suit absolutely everybody. So make sure when you're writing yours, that is structured and it's easy to follow. So you're almost telling a story, because what you want to do is you want to convince the funders that your project's the best and they should be funding it. But for some of our grants, we get hundreds of applications. If you send in an application that isn't easy to follow, or there's a lot of confusing kind of jargon in it, it's likely to score a little bit lower compared to someone who's laid out a clear plan. Word limits don't mean, so if the word limit's 500 words, that doesn't mean you have to hit 500 words. That's just the max. But of course, if you can say all the important stuff with as fewer words as possible, it makes it a bit easier to read as well. Budget, that's a lot of times that's what people get marks down on, that they haven't provided enough detail in their budget and they're making a lot of assumptions as well. Also, don't overestimate your budget. Reviewers often pick up that when, for example, a piece of equipment that they're requesting costs a lot more than a simple Google search will reveal. So don't try and fabricate your budget too much, because people will pick up on that. And also, if there's a piece of equipment in your budget, but not in your methods, that will be questioned as well. An example we had in the last round is someone was doing some species recording, and they really great methods of how they're going to do everything. And then in their budget, they've requested an expensive camera. And nowhere in their methods had they said they're going to be taking pictures of these species. Now, the camera might mean you assume that that's going to happen, but unless it's in the methods, then we can never make assumptions. So never make assumptions that the reviewer will know what you're talking about. Which brings me on to my next point. Avoid those assumptions as much as you can. Be as clear as possible, because our review panel is global. Many grant reviewers are global. They're not going to be experts. So make sure everything's as clear as possible. So some examples I have is sometimes UK applicants, they'll say, I'll be studying birds at an RSPB site. And anyone from the UK knows what an RSPB site is, but anyone outside of the UK might not know what that is. So that's why when you're writing, I'll be studying an RSPB site, they are a bird charity and this is all the great stuff that they do. But make sure that just because you know what it is doesn't mean the reviewers will know what it is, regardless of how famous you think that organization is. Unless it's something like Google or Apple, it's likely that the charitable organizations, other reviewers may not know who they are. The same applies to if you're applying on behalf of an organization. Make sure you're really clear on what that organization does. Another example of avoiding assumptions is, especially with pedagogy grants, if you're using the term young people, make sure you really specify what that means, because for some, young people is anyone aged 18 to 30. A lot of times it's 18 to 25. For some people, it's anyone under 18. Different definitions in different organizations, different countries. So if you're using terms like young people, make sure at least once in your application, you really define what that means. And make sure you are specific with your methods as well. Another reason why people often get marks down is they say, I'm going to go to 2 classrooms and do this great workshop. But that doesn't mean anything, because a classroom could be 2 students, it could be 60 students. So make sure you're being really specific with your methods. I'll go to 2 classrooms, each classroom's going to have 30 students, and I'll go during the morning session. I've already agreed with the teacher as well. So again, you want to provide reassurance for reviewers that you know exactly who your target audience are, how many people you're going to engage with. If you're going to go to schools, don't just say, I'm going to go to a number of schools. And of course, sometimes it can be difficult to know how many schools you would attend at the start of a project, and reviewers don't expect you would know that, but they like to see targets at least. I'm going to go to at least 5 schools and engage with 100 children, and this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to contact teachers. I'm going to contact 10 schools to get to that minimum 5, but making sure you're providing all this reassurance, because, and this goes back to being overly ambitious as well. Sometimes people will say, I'll engage with 500 students, but they never actually say how they're going to do it, where those 500 students are going to come from. So just make sure really, really specific with those methods and with those numbers. Get someone else to proofread it as well. Most of the time, you only get one chance to submit your application. So if you do get a rejection, it's unlikely that you can submit that again in the same round. And a lot of grant-giving bodies will not allow resubmissions either. So you really do get one chance with your project idea, unless you're submitting to other funding bodies as well. But a really good piece of advice is making sure someone else is reading your application and make sure that they can understand it as well. Because if that person reads it and they've got questions, it's likely the reviewers might have similar questions. And this goes back to my other comment of making sure you submit before the deadline, giving yourself plenty of time, because you don't want to ask someone to proofread your application and it's the day of the deadline, because it's unlikely you'll get all that feedback in time. So just make sure you're giving yourself plenty of time. And finally, even though all of these are useful tips, there really isn't a magic wand when it comes to grant writing. A lot of it does take practice. It does happen sometimes, but it's probably a little bit unlikely your very first application will get funded, because it is practice, which is why proofreading's important and making sure you're doing everything on time as well. You could write an amazing application and there could just be one very small reason why it doesn't get funded, or if there is a lot of fundable applications, there does have to be a cut off somewhere. So just remember, most of it is just practice, but following a few of these tips can help make your application stand out a bit. Just looking at the time, too bad. So going back to funding criteria and how critical it is, this is just the funding criteria for the British Ecological Society grants. So all of our grants are member-only grants. So if you're not a member straight away, won't be considered. Our grants don't have any geographical restrictions. So we are a global organisation. So we'll fund projects all over the world. And you can be teaching anywhere from early years all the way up to kind of university students. So anywhere that's in an education setting. You can be from any industry. So Neil gave quite a good example. His background was in fossils and paleoecology, and he's moved into that pedagogical kind of research area. So it can be for those new to teaching, or it can be for those who want to transition into pedagogy as well. Our grants, because they're relatively small at 5,000, are awarded to individuals, not organisations. That means that we fund you to carry out the project, not the school or university to carry out the project. So the money does belong to you, so it's your idea. Just for our pedagogical grants, they can form part of degrees, masters, PhDs or fellowships, or it does need to be an independent piece of research. And if there is any permits or more importantly, ethics that need to be considered, it's important that in your application that you've shown that all that has been considered as well. So what do our grants fund? So short-term assistance, so student interns, researchers, small piece of equipment that you need to complete the research, any costs associated with that data collection, and we also can fund incentives as well. So if you are doing things like surveys or workshops, you want to incentive people to attend, that's okay. And also any travel or kind of food costs or accommodation costs that you need to visit educational locations as well. Generally, what we don't cover is the lead applicant's salary. So it isn't a wage, it's not a salary, it's not a stipend, it's a grant. So you can't ask for your salary to be covered. If you are leaving teaching, the salary can't be used to cover someone else's salary. They can't be used for institutional overheads either, so no insurance or electricity bills or anything. And general equipment that you might already have, such as laptops and cameras. So really, For our pedagogical grants, they're more for visiting those locations, access incentives for smaller pieces of equipment, hiring researchers as well. And they also can't be used to cover your tuition fees. So if you are a PhD student and you're looking to cover your tuition fees, our grants do not cover them. So they're not scholarships either. So here are just some titles of some of the projects we've funded. So you can see Neil's one there at the top. We've also supported a project in Benin engaging with smallholder farmers and teaching logical education. And then we also have funded a project with playful learning as well. But one stat I just want to bring up is our success rate. At the moment, it's 23%, which is actually considered a pretty good success rate. But this goes back to my don't be too disheartened if you fund for a grant and you're not successful the first or second time. Grants are highly, highly competitive, and the majority of grant given bodies have success rates between kind of 12 to 15%. So at the moment, 23% is relatively good. So pedagogy still is a relatively new area of research as well. So as it does become more and more popular, that number might decrease a little bit as we get more applications. So that is, yeah, just to go back to success rates as well. Sometimes when it is really, really tight between, say if there's 2 projects, there's only enough funding for 1 project, sometimes one tiny little mistake can rule out your application. And again, I wouldn't take that to heart. Just grant giving is extremely competitive, and sometimes it does take a few tries before you do get funded. But back to one of my very first points, I recommend everyone to apply for grants if they're eligible, because that feedback is often very, very useful and can help you write your next application. So I'll pass on to Marianne now. So Marianne has a lot of pedagogical research experience. Marianne, I'll pass over to you, and if you just let me know when you want to move to the next slides.
Dylan, do you just want to put everything on that slide for just now? You can save me having to say click, click, click. Thank you. Brilliant. So hi, everybody. As I said before, my name is Marianne Freeman, and I've been involved with the BES for quite a number of years now, almost 10 years, I think, in various different capacities. I started as the Education, Training and Careers Committee member. And from there, I ended up moving over to the Grants Committee and have been there for the last 6 years, and more recently as the co-chair for the Grants Committee. And I think one of the things that I was told when I was first looking at moving into this Grants Committee position was that if you sit on the Grants Committee, you get a better understanding of which projects actually get funding, and it helps to improve your own grant writing process, which I think definitely I would agree with. And something to think about if you're thinking about applying for grants, there are always people looking for volunteers that can kind of sit on committees and help out. So I'm sure there'll be positions coming up on either of the societies that are here today at some point in the future, and that's something that you might want to do. So I've been part of the development group that put together this pedagogical grant, and my kind of background, although I have a PhD in kind of population ecology, I have worked in a whole variety of different places, including the RSPB as a field teacher. I've worked for the Wildlife Trust in their education department, and also worked for the Royal Zoological Society for Scotland in their education setting. And it was through this role and the collaborations with the University of Edinburgh really that sort of got me delving into my first kind of pedagogical research. So this became a sort of 3-year-long project, which was particularly exploring teaching and delivery of reproductive education outside of the classroom. Something we're still working on now, and hopefully there will be some papers coming from this, but it's been a big project really looking at it. And essentially for the Royal Zoological Society for Scotland, I was based at Edinburgh Zoo. And one of the sessions that they deliver, one of the most sort of popular sessions that they deliver is their sex education, their cycle of life, a session which looked at reproductive aspects of both human and animal reproduction. So it was a full kind of sex education session that really actually what we wanted to do was look at why teachers were choosing this, why this was the most kind of popular session. And we had a mixed methods. So you've heard about some methods earlier on, and we used content analysis. So listening to what was being learnt through the session, through the pupils and what they were talking about. We carried out interviews with the teachers to really understand about the teachers' sort of views of this opportunity and how they would use that within their own teaching once they go back to class. And we also did questionnaires looking at the impacts of the education through using this as a session, but also through classes that didn't come to the zoo. So sort of comparing the understanding and the knowledge that was gained by the students as well. And we were able to do some long-term research on this as well, because in Scotland this is delivered in sort of 11-year-olds, which is primary 6, and because they're in primary school until primary 7, we were able to go back the following year and look at the impacts as well of the teaching. But what was really interesting was really just looking at how the teachers actually use this session, and often they use it as a springboard. A lot of them are saying that they felt unconfident in actually delivering sex education, and that having an outdoor experience where they could kind of have that information being delivered to the pupils in a setting that was outside of the classroom was actually a nicer kind of better way of delivering that. So that was one of the kind of first types of educational projects that I got involved in. But since then, I've moved more formally into higher education. I'm now the subject lead of the Animal and Zoo department at the University Centre Sparshot, which is just outside Winchester. And through that and through the PGCE that I've been involved in, I've been really interested in developing further and kind of pedagogical research, and get delivered a number of presentations, and got involved in some further publications in this area. One of the things that I find really interesting is the number of students that are interested in getting into this kind of research. Perhaps they want to get into educational fields themselves after, even though they're on a completely different, maybe animal-based, ecology-based course in the first place. And so a number of these projects have been projects that have jumped off master's students and undergraduate students that have been interested in doing more educational-based research. So that's a little bit about me. Do you want to move to the next slide, Dylan, and just click everything? So in terms of kind of thinking about pedagogical grants, we've had a lot of these points already, but just sort of thinking about the feedback that we've had on some of the applications and some of the really important things to consider. Specifically on this topic, one of the things that it continuously kind of comes up is how is the work sort of following on, building on, or incorporating previous research that's been done, and so ensuring that the background to your particular topic has some aspect of an evidence-based approach to what you're planning on doing. So using the previous research, bringing in topics that kind of relate to the different concepts or particular frameworks that you might be relating to, whether that's looking at aspects of the curriculum, whether it's aspects of the delivery methods of a particular aspect of education, or even sort of aspects of looking at assessments. I don't think that's really been mentioned yet, but you could be pulling together a grant that really explores assessments of learning, or assessments for learning, or even assessments as learning as well. So there's lots of different tools that could be used within that sort of teaching aspect. I think, it was mentioned by Neil earlier about really thinking outside the box and being innovative. And we know that through this kind of pandemic sort of pedagogy, I think there's a few papers that have come out looking at pandemic pedagogy. So we've got lots of research already on teaching in an online setting and using kind of virtual teaching. So, don't just kind of reinvent the wheel, but really build on that if you're interested in looking at more sort of creative strategies. Current things that might come up might be things like looking at AI and generative AI as a method for actually incorporating into the teaching. So that could be more of an aspect that's becoming more popular, or even sort of looking at aspects of authentic assessment as well. And so how can we incorporate what is being done in the field into assessments, and how does that impact on learning? So really, we're kind of thinking about how we can enhance the teaching that's being given and enhance the student experience, but also look at potential change as well. I think a lot of people have talked about impact and making sure that that's included in the plan. So thinking about how you're going to evaluate what's being done, trying to make sure that you are looking more wider at what you're doing and where it fits in, working with other organisations, for example, or how this could be applied to other organisations. And then the last two aspects really are sort of very current and kind of something that a lot of people are looking at in terms of collaboration, but collaboration potentially with the learners that you're thinking about. So everybody comes from different backgrounds, everyone has different experiences, and we can't all understand the experiences that they've had just from our own experience. So working with the learners potentially to develop new methods might be something that would fit really nicely into your plan. So think about how you're going to do that and how you're going to bring that together. For example, there are a number of organisations that have produced sort of lesson plans, for example, that have been created with the students together. So that could be an example of what you might go on to do. And then finally, really thinking about how your method is inclusive. Now, it might be that inclusivity is an aspect that you are particularly focusing on for your grant, but even if it's not, how are you actually going to ensure that any delivery or any assessment is inclusive? And so thinking about that, Equality Act, if you're in the UK, and those protected characteristics, and what we can do to ensure that any of that teaching really is providing that inclusive feel as well. So yeah, that's a little overview from me, and I think I'm going to hand back to Dylan now for some questions. Thank you.
Trying to find myself there. Perfect. Thank you, Marianne. So we are moving on to the kind of questions bit now. If anyone does have any questions they want to ask, hopefully kind of summarize after all of this, that you have a slightly better understanding of what pedagogical research is, how to transition into pedagogical research as well, a few examples of kind of current research that's happening, and a little bit about writing your own grant applications as well whenever you feel ready. And I just kind of like to finish up on, again, I always encourage people to write grant applications. It's quite exciting to start seeing your project go down on paper and getting people to review it and everything. So as I always encourage grants people to write them.